You typed the message, read it 3 times, then deleted it. Not because it was wrong, not because you didn't mean it, but because somewhere between your fingers and the send button, a question appeared, quiet, almost polite, and it stopped you cold. What will they think? Maybe it was a text to a friend where you finally wanted to say something true. Maybe it was a comment you almost left, a boundary you almost held, an opinion you almost expressed out loud in a room where everyone seemed to agree on something you didn't. You've been there, more times than you'd probably like to admit. And here is what makes it so strange. You are not a coward. You are not weak. You know what you think. You know what you want. You know, in that quiet part of yourself that doesn't perform for anyone exactly who you are and what you actually believe. But the moment it's time to show that person to the world, really show them, something tightens in your chest. A very old instinct activates, and before your conscious mind has even processed what's happening, you have already softened the words, swallowed the opinion, smiled when you didn't mean it, agreed when you didn't feel it, and shaped yourself just slightly, just enough, into something a little more palatable, a little more acceptable, a little less you. And the worst part? You barely noticed it happen. This is not a story about insecurity in the conventional sense. It is not about shyness or social anxiety or a lack of confidence. This is something far more invisible and far more universal. A pattern so deeply embedded in how humans are built that most people live their entire lives inside it without ever once questioning whether it was a choice. Because here is the truth that almost no one talks about honestly. From the moment you are old enough to understand that people respond to you, that your behavior produces reactions, that your words create impressions, that your choices can earn warmth or withdraw it, you began building a version of yourself designed for survival inside the group. Not for truth, not for freedom, for approval. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment you can point to, that survival version began to feel like the real one. You stopped asking what you wanted and started asking what would be accepted. You stopped moving toward what felt true and started moving away from what might disappoint. And the distance between who you actually are and who you present to the world began to grow, quietly, invisibly, one small compromise at a time. Carl Jung spent his life studying exactly what happens to a person when that distance grows too wide for too long. And what he found is more unsettling and more liberating than most people are prepared for. Because the question is not simply why you delete the message before sending it. The question is, how much of your life have you already lived in the editing process? And what have you lost in every draft that never got sent? Few thinkers understood this dilemma as precisely or as compassionately as Carl Jung. He once said that the greatest privilege in life is the chance to become who you truly are. But that privilege becomes impossible to claim when a person has spent decades performing a character invented purely for social survival. When the mask worn long enough begins to feel like a face, the person behind it starts to forget they were ever wearing one at all. This is the quiet tragedy of a life built around approval. And it runs deeper than most people realize. Because as you construct and maintain the version of yourself that others seem to prefer, the parts of you that don't fit the image, your anger, your unconventional instincts, your contradictions, your fears, your raw and inconvenient desires must go somewhere. They cannot simply vanish. They are pushed inward, buried beneath layers of acceptable behavior, and stored in a territory of the psyche that Jung called the shadow. Over time, the shadow grows dense with everything you refuse to acknowledge, and the person standing in the light becomes thinner, more curated, less real. Here is the cruel paradox at the heart of this entire dynamic. The more relentlessly you pursue the approval of others, the less at peace you become with yourself. The more you shape your identity around the expectations of the world, the more you sever yourself from the deepest and most powerful source you have: the courage to live honestly, to exist without apology, to be genuinely and irreversibly yourself. This is the invisible prison. And the extraordinary thing about it is that it has no walls you can point to, no locks you can identify. It is built entirely out of fear. The fear of being seen too clearly, judged too harshly, or accepted too conditionally. What follows is an exploration of what happens when a person finally decides to step outside that prison. Through the framework of Jungian psychology, we will examine why certain personalities are more vulnerable to this pattern than others. We will look closely at the persona, the social mask we spend enormous energy maintaining, and at the shadow, the hidden territory it conceals. And we will trace the arc of what Jung called individuation, the long, difficult, profoundly necessary journey toward becoming whole. But before we go further, there is something worth naming honestly. This path is not comfortable. Maintaining a role that others find acceptable is, in many ways, the easier road. Pleasing people feels safer than tolerating their disappointment. And so the question that sits at the center of all of this is not complicated in its wording, only in its weight. Do you want to be accepted, or do you want to be free? Because in many of life's most important moments, those two things pull in opposite directions. If you are willing to sit with that tension, what comes next may change not only the way you understand yourself, but the way you choose to live. There is a question worth pausing on before we go deeper. Why do some people seem almost architecturally dependent on the approval of others, while different individuals appear capable of walking their own path even when criticism, misunderstanding, and rejection are the immediate result? The instinctive answer tends to be confidence, or the absence of it. Life experience. Upbringing. But Jung believed the explanation was rooted far more precisely in the structure of the individual psyche. In his work Psychological Types, Jung proposed that every person has a natural psychological orientation, a dominant direction in which the mind habitually moves. Some people orient primarily outward, toward the external world of people, events, and social dynamics. Others orient primarily inward, toward the inner landscape of thought, reflection, and private experience. He called these orientations extroversion and introversion, terms that have since been borrowed, diluted, and somewhat distorted by popular culture, but which Jung intended in a very specific and nuanced sense. He further described 4 psychological functions through which we interpret and navigate reality: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Each person naturally leans on one of these more than the others, and the particular combination of orientation and dominant function creates a psychological fingerprint, a pattern that shapes not just how you perceive the world, but how vulnerable you are to certain psychological pressures. Consider someone whose psychology is strongly organized around what Jung called extroverted feeling. This is a person whose inner compass naturally aligns with the emotional atmosphere of their surroundings. They are attuned almost instinctively to what others value, what others feel, what others expect. This makes them extraordinarily empathetic. It makes them gifted in relationships and naturally skilled at navigating social environments. But it also renders them genuinely vulnerable in a specific way. When your sense of self is built primarily around social harmony, the possibility of disrupting that harmony feels threatening at a fundamental level. The need to please is not a surface habit. It is woven into the architecture of how meaning is made. And when approval becomes that deeply embedded, the identity begins to reorganize itself around it. Because society itself is not stable. Public opinion shifts. Expectations evolve. What earns admiration in one season attracts criticism in the next. When your internal stability depends on something that unpredictable, genuine peace becomes structurally difficult to achieve. But this particular vulnerability is not confined to one personality pattern. Someone whose psychology is organized around introverted thinking might struggle with the same fundamental problem from an entirely different angle. Rather than seeking harmony through emotional attunement, this person fears that their ideas, careful, complex, internally developed over long periods, will be misunderstood, dismissed, or mocked. The response is not to socialize more anxiously, but to withdraw more strategically. Thoughts remain unspoken. Original positions stay hidden behind safer, more conventional ones. The result is identical. A life lived partially, a self that never fully emerges. What Jung revealed through this framework is not that certain types are doomed to approval seeking. He revealed that the need for external validation can infiltrate any psychological structure. It simply disguises itself in the language of that structure. In one person, it looks like constant people-pleasing. In another, it looks like careful self-concealment. In another still, it appears as a compulsive drive toward achievement, not for fulfillment, but for the praise that achievement reliably produces. The more unconscious this dynamic remains, the more quietly and completely it governs a life. Understanding your psychological tendencies is not about assigning yourself a fixed category or accepting a predetermined limitation. It is about developing enough self-knowledge to recognize your own patterns in real time. When you can see the moment your mind automatically bends toward approval, you gain something enormously valuable: the ability to choose differently. Because the danger in all of this accumulates slowly, invisibly, over time. Each time you silence yourself to avoid conflict, a pattern is reinforced. Each time you adjust your behavior to meet someone else's expectation rather than your own standard, the habit grows stronger. The brain learns what the behavior teaches it: that approval is safety, that rejection is danger, that smoothing yourself into an acceptable shape is the price of belonging. And then one day, perhaps not dramatically, perhaps not with any single identifiable event, the pattern stops feeling like a pattern. It feels like personality. It feels like who you are. This is the moment the trap closes entirely. Because there is an unavoidable truth that no amount of performance can escape, it is impossible to satisfy everyone. No matter how carefully you present yourself, someone will misread you. Someone will disapprove. Someone will project their own unresolved judgments onto you and find you wanting. When your entire sense of worth is constructed around preventing that outcome, you end up in a war you cannot win, sacrificing pieces of yourself indefinitely in pursuit of an approval that is always just slightly out of reach. Every time you betray your own instinct to secure someone else's comfort, something erodes inside you. Not loudly, not all at once, but over years, these small compromises compound, and many people arrive at a point where the life around them looks completely presentable, functional, respectable, perhaps even enviable, while something inside feels hollow and disconnected. That hollowness is not depression in the clinical sense, not necessarily. It is the specific disquiet of a person who has been living too far from themselves for too long. The first step towards something different is not a dramatic gesture. It is awareness. Plain, steady, non-judgmental awareness. You begin to watch your own responses. You notice the precise moment when your instinct is to smooth things over rather than speak the truth. You practice holding a position when every conditioned reflex pushes you to abandon it. You allow yourself to say no in situations where yes would be easier, not because conflict is valuable for its own sake, but because honesty is. Gradually, something begins to shift, not all at once, not without resistance. But the internal landscape starts to reorganize around something more solid than the changing opinions of the people around you. Yet even this shift, this growing awareness of the approval pattern, only scratches the surface of what is actually happening psychologically. Because beneath the behavior, beneath the habit, there is a structure that actively sustains all of it. A structure that Jung named, examined, and found to be one of the most powerful forces shaping human social life. He called it the persona. Every human being wears masks. This is not a character flaw, it is an inevitable feature of social existence. From early childhood, we learn to modulate our behavior depending on context. We smile when we are tired. We say we are fine when we are not. We adjust our tone in a meeting, our vocabulary with different friends, our entire emotional register depending on whether we are with family or colleagues or strangers. Each of these adjustments is a layer of persona. In his writings on analytical psychology, Jung described the persona as the psychological interface between the individual and the world. It is the version of the self designed to function within social structures. It is the role or collection of roles that allows us to navigate collective life. And importantly, the persona in itself is not the problem. Society genuinely requires us to inhabit roles. The professional role, the parental role, the communal role, these structures allow interaction to function. Without some degree of persona, social life would be chaos. The mask is a tool, and tools are neutral. The problem begins when the tool is mistaken for the person holding it. When someone becomes so identified with their persona that the role begins to feel like the self, the mask stops being something you wear and becomes something you are. What began as a practical adaptation turns into a false identity, one constructed not from the inside out, but from the outside in, according to what the world has signaled it wants to see. And the more energy you invest in maintaining that carefully curated image, the wider the gap grows between what you project and what you actually are. At a certain point, you may notice that your life is no longer something you are living so much as something you are managing. Relationships are navigated according to what they require of the image. Opinions are expressed only after being screened for acceptability. Even private decisions pass through the filter of how they might appear. Consider for a moment, without defensiveness, how many decisions in your own life have been shaped primarily by what someone else expected of you? How many relationships have continued long past their genuine expiration simply because ending them would require disappointing someone? How many times have you held back the real version of your thought because the edited version was safer? Each of those moments is the persona at work, and each of them costs something that cannot easily be recovered. The willingness to disappoint people, genuinely, honestly, without cruelty but without apology, is not a character flaw. It is a form of respect. Respect for truth. Respect for the other person's ability to handle reality, and, perhaps most critically, respect for the self that exists behind the performance. Jung argued that authentic psychological development begins at precisely the moment a person recognizes that the persona is not their true identity. This recognition, simple in description, genuinely difficult in practice, is the starting point of a deeper transformation he spent his career mapping and naming. He called it individuation. But individuation cannot begin in earnest without confronting what the persona exists to conceal. Because behind every carefully maintained social mask, there is a reason the mask feels necessary. There is a territory of the self that was judged at some point to be too dangerous, too unacceptable, or too difficult to reveal. Jung called this territory the shadow. And it is the shadow, Not the persona, not the approval-seeking pattern, not even the fear of rejection that sits at the deepest root of this entire dynamic. If you have followed this far, you have already begun to see how the face you present to the world may be, at least partially, a construction. But recognizing the construction is only the beginning of the work. The deeper challenge, and the one that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding, is the confrontation with what lies behind it. Jung described individuation not as a theory, but as an experience. In works like Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious and Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he traced the path of a person who stops trying to become what the world has requested of them and begins the difficult, irreversible process of uncovering who they actually are beneath all of that. Accumulated conditioning. This is not about becoming someone new. It is about rediscovering the person you were before expectations began carving themselves into you. And that distinction matters enormously. Because the false self, the identity constructed for social survival, is not built overnight. It is assembled slowly across years out of messages so ordinary that they rarely draw attention to themselves. Boys should not be too emotional. Girls should not be too assertive. Success means achievement that others can see. Vulnerability is something to protect carefully. You will only matter as much as your accomplishments make you matter. These messages arrive in countless forms, through explicit instruction, through observed behavior, through the rewards and withdrawals of love and belonging. None of them necessarily arrive with malicious intent, but they accumulate in the psyche like sediment, and over time they shape a set of unspoken rules about who is acceptable to be and who is not. Conforming to those rules is reinforced constantly. When you match expectations, the social environment responds with warmth and inclusion. Conflict decreases. Life flows more easily along predictable channels. The comfort is real. The reward is immediate. But the cost is structural. Every adjustment made in the direction of acceptability is also a movement away from genuine selfhood. The distance may feel negligible at first. Over decades, it becomes vast. And the truly disorienting thing is that after enough time inside the constructed identity, you stop noticing the distance at all. The constructed self and the real self seem like the same thing, until a moment of crisis, or exhaustion, or unexpected stillness forces you to look more honestly. Individuation is the process of reversing this. Not violently, not all at once, but with sustained and courageous honesty. It requires dismantling beliefs you have organized your life around. It requires allowing identities to collapse that once felt essential. And most uncomfortably, it requires the willingness to become a version of yourself that certain people in your life may not immediately welcome or understand. Sometimes the person most unsettled by your authenticity is not a stranger. It is someone close. A parent who preferred a more manageable version of you. A partner who relied on your predictable agreeableness. A social circle whose coherence depended on no one being too distinctly themselves. And sometimes, the hardest adjustment of all is internal. The idealized self-image, the version of you that worked so hard to appear admirable, capable, and beyond reproach, must be seen clearly and humanized before the authentic one can fully breathe. This is why Jung consistently said that individuation is not a destination. It is a direction. A lifelong orientation toward greater honesty, greater wholeness, greater integration of everything you are, including the parts that were exiled. Which brings us to the shadow itself. The shadow is everything within the psyche that has been pushed out of conscious awareness. Not because it is intrinsically evil or dangerous, but because at some point, usually in childhood or adolescence, it was judged incompatible with the image required for belonging. Anger, that was too threatening to express, ambition that felt selfish to claim, grief that seemed excessive, desire that seemed shameful, independence that felt like betrayal. All of it was quietly routed away from the light and stored in the unconscious. But stored does not mean dissolved. The shadow does not weaken with neglect, it grows more influential. In Aeon and throughout his broader body of work, Jung was careful to clarify something that is often overlooked. The shadow is not purely a collection of weaknesses or moral failures. It also contains real power, assertiveness that was labeled aggression and suppressed, creativity that was deemed impractical and buried, emotional depth that was called dramatic and quietly abandoned. These qualities, vital, alive, genuinely yours, are part of the shadow too. Which means the shadow holds both what you fear about yourself and what you have not yet allowed yourself to become. The pursuit of approval becomes, at this depth, a strategy for keeping the shadow hidden. If others approve of you consistently and completely, perhaps they will never look closely enough to find the parts you are not sure about yourself. The performance of acceptability functions as a kind of camouflage. But this strategy fails at the level where it matters most. As long as significant portions of the psyche remain buried and unacknowledged, the fear of being truly seen never diminishes, it compounds. Every criticism feels like a possible exposure. Every disapproval touches something tender and unresolved. Because the judgments of others have access to the same territory you have been refusing to examine. On some level, you already suspect that what they might find, if they looked carefully, is real. And so the cycle tightens. You perform more carefully. You seek more reassurance. And the parts of yourself that were never integrated grow larger in the dark. What breaks this cycle is not what most people expect. It is not the accumulation of enough approval to finally feel safe. It is the opposite. The willingness to turn inward with honesty and without judgment, and acknowledge what has been living there unexamined. Shadow integration begins with that single act of honest recognition, the quiet internal statement, "This too is part of me." Not only the qualities that earn admiration, not only the traits you would be comfortable having others observe, but the envy, the resentment, the fear, the selfish calculations, the moments of pettiness, the desires that feel too large or too dark or too honest to confess. These are not aberrations. They are components of a complete human being. Pretending they are absent does not eliminate them. It amplifies their unconscious authority. What is refused acknowledgement internally will express itself externally, through disproportionate emotional reactions, through the projection of your own unacknowledged qualities onto others, through a low-grade anxiety that never quite resolves. What you will not face within yourself will eventually confront you from the outside. True integration is not about acting on every shadow impulse without restraint. It is not a license for cruelty or recklessness. It is about bringing these dimensions of the self into conscious awareness, understanding them, sitting with them, allowing them to be known rather than feared, so that they can be guided rather than suppressed. The difference between a person who has done this work and one who has not is visible in a specific way. The person who has genuinely faced their shadow is no longer divided against themselves. The internal civil war quiets. And a person who is no longer at war internally is not easily destabilized by the judgments of the external world. When you have already accepted yourself fully, including the difficult parts, the contradictory parts, the parts that do not photograph well, the opinion of others loses a remarkable amount of its grip. Not because you become indifferent to human connection, not because you perform emotional detachment, but because the threat of exposure no longer frightens you in the same way. There is nothing hidden left to protect. And when there is nothing to protect, there is nothing to fear. This is the real and lasting end of the fear of disapproval. Not numbness, not defiance, but depth. A depth of self-knowledge that makes external validation feel less urgent. Because the validation that matters most has been located somewhere more reliable. This journey from persona to shadow to integrated selfhood is not only a psychological theory. It was Jung's own lived experience. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the most significant professional rupture of his life, his break from Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic establishment that Freud had built. At the time of their collaboration, Jung occupied one of the most envied positions in the intellectual world. He was Freud's most celebrated prot, widely regarded as the natural heir to the psychoanalytic movement. Freud was not merely a colleague to Jung, he was a mentor, a father figure in the domain of ideas, the person whose approval had once meant more to Jung professionally than almost anyone else's. Remaining within Freud's framework would have meant continued prestige, influence, security, a future already arranged in favorable shape. But something was growing inside Jung that could no longer be contained within Freudian boundaries. Freud located the driving forces of human psychology primarily in sexual energy and repression. Jung, through years of studying dreams, mythology, religious symbolism, and the comparative patterns of world cultures, was arriving somewhere different. The psyche, as he was coming to understand it, was not primarily a pressure system of suppressed drives. It was a vast interior world, populated by archetypes, animated by symbolic meaning, connected through what he would eventually call the collective unconscious to something far larger than individual biography. This was not a minor theoretical adjustment. It was a fundamental divergence, and Jung knew precisely what expressing it would cost him. He knew criticism was coming. He understood that the word betrayal would be used. He recognized that the approval of the very community that had celebrated him would be withdrawn, possibly permanently. The professional isolation he was walking toward was real. The personal loss was real. The grief of breaking from someone who had functioned as a father figure was real. He chose authenticity anyway. Not without anguish, not without extended internal struggle, not with the clean certainty of someone who has no doubt, but with the harder and more honest kind of courage, the kind that moves forward while still feeling afraid. After the break, Jung entered what he later described as the most difficult and disorienting period of his life. Stripped of institutional belonging, largely dismissed by the scientific community that had once celebrated him, he turned inward. He immersed himself in mythology, in alchemy, in the symbolic languages of ancient civilizations. He mapped his own unconscious with a rigor and honesty that most people reserve only for the external world. Out of that difficult interior passage came the full architecture of what we now call analytical psychology, a body of ideas that has shaped literature, philosophy, theology, and the human sciences for nearly a century. But it was only possible because he was willing to lose the approval of the people who had meant the most to him professionally, only because he faced his own shadow, the wounded pride, the fear of isolation, the part of him that wanted desperately to remain inside the safety of belonging and moved through it rather than around it. Jung's story is often told as the history of an intellectual movement, but at a human level, it is a story about a person standing at a crossroads that every life eventually reaches, in one form or another. At some point, you will be asked to separate from something familiar, a relationship that no longer fits who you are becoming, A career path built on someone else's definition of success. A version of yourself that was constructed for approval rather than truth. A community whose coherence depends on your continued smallness. When that moment arrives, the choice will feel exactly as it felt to Jung. Not clean, not simple, not free of cost, but unmistakably clear. You can remain accepted and confined. Or you can risk rejection and move towards something more genuinely your own. Preparing for that moment is the real practical work of everything discussed here. It is not enough to understand the theory of the persona or to intellectually appreciate the concept of shadow integration. The question is whether you can carry that understanding into the actual texture of your daily life, into the specific relationships, the real conversations, the concrete decisions where the fear of disapproval makes itself felt most sharply. This is where the work lives, not in the abstract, but in the particular. In your willingness to express an opinion that might not be received warmly. In your ability to hold a boundary even when someone responds with disappointment. In the quiet daily choice to act from your own values rather than from the anxious calculation of how your actions will be judged. None of this means indifference to others. Genuine authenticity is not a performance of independence. It is not contrarianism dressed up as self-knowledge. It is simply the ongoing commitment to let your life be shaped from the inside rather than the outside. To make the person you are in private continuous with the person you present to the world. Jung believed that psychological wholeness, what he called the self, the deepest organizing center of the entire psyche, begins to emerge when a person stops trying to be the ideal version of themselves that others can accept, and starts honestly inhabiting the complex, contradictory, irreducibly human version that actually exists. The light and the shadow together. The persona understood as a tool rather than an identity. The authentic center no longer hidden beneath layers of social management, but present, inhabited, real. This is what individuation moves toward, not perfection. Not the elimination of fear or vulnerability or social awareness, but wholeness, the felt sense of being entirely, honestly, and without apology yourself in a life that reflects that. The need for approval will return. Even after genuine growth, it finds new disguises, surfaces in new contexts, whispers through the voice of new relationships. That is why this is not a problem to be solved once and then set aside. It is a practice, something returned to again and again, with patience rather than frustration. Every day presents the same question in different forms. Will you act from your genuine self, or from the fear of how your genuine self might be received? That is the question worth sitting with honestly. In which area of your life does the need for approval run deepest right now? Where do you feel it most concretely? In how you speak, in what you do not say, in the choices you make or avoid? Recognizing the specific shape it takes in your particular life is already the beginning of something different. Because the moment something unconscious is brought into the light of clear awareness, its grip begins to loosen. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably, irreversibly. The path toward a life lived with genuine honesty is not comfortable, and no honest account of it should pretend otherwise. But there is a kind of freedom available on the other side of that discomfort. Quiet, durable, and entirely your own, that no amount of approval from others can replicate. That freedom is what this entire journey has been pointing toward. And now, having named it, the question is simply what you choose to do with what you know.